So let me start by introducing myself. My name is Jeremy Wood. I'm the lead for this user group. It's actually DC based, but with the internet, it doesn't really matter. But our big focus is on Microsoft technologies within the government sphere, the public sector sphere. And so we invite speakers to come in and talk about that because the offerings within the government are limited in many cases and have issues and or have challenges, and there are workarounds for some of those things, not workarounds for others. So we like to invite guests to come speak from that perspective. We do record this, so if you don't want your video as part of that recording, feel free to turn off your camera. It's up to you. But we do put it out on YouTube, and I'll share a link to that by the end of this, so that in case you're interested in seeing past episodes. That brings us to Greg. Thank you so much for reaching out and volunteering to do this. And I'm really looking forward to, hearing this topic. Compliance is huge and cybersecurity is huge, and the combination of culture in there has me intrigued, and I'm very interested in hearing what you share today. So I'll hand it over to you.
Hi, everybody. Well, my name is Dr. McVerry, and I want to welcome us to this joint meeting of the Washington, D.C. Is it a working group, or is it what do you guys say? It's a
user group.
It's a group. Well, and that's how you build culture. You're talking about how do we build culture. And this is part of a CMMC class that we are running at Southern Connecticut State University. And with us today, we have one of our instructors, Leighton Johnson, and three of our learners, Jacob, Peter, and Michelle, who have been taking this class together in Microsoft Teams, because we're really trying to stress this idea that we have to deal with compliance in the government space. Most companies, most MSPs are working in the Microsoft architecture. And so how do we leverage tools that our companies already have to kind of get at, compliance and cybersecurity in the federal government space? But I thought before we got to the roots of cybersecurity, let's kind of take a little quick journey on the path. What got us here? What is the history? So let me quickly share my screen. All right, and enlarge this here. All right, I think are you guys looking at my timeline? Well, where do we start this? Let's go back to, rewind, we'll take it back to 2002, and we have the Federal Information Security Management Act passed. Now, this updated some of the earlier laws, but this is the first time where we really started that every agency had to develop and document and implement agency-wide policies, and it wasn't really supply chain risk management. But FISMA does ask you to start considering risk management and threat analysis. Every agency was required to document and how they deal with threats and how they're going to handle that. Then, that led to, there was other bills going on. The Cybersecurity Research and Development Act, that got passed in Congress around 2002 at the same time. And now we have, this is what authorized NSF and the Secretary of Commerce to give NIST a bunch of money to do a bunch of stuff. And they wrote a bunch of stuff. And that stuff we pretty much know as FIPS. But even before that happened comes the Homeland Security Presidential Directive number 7. Now, and this was for the national policy to identify infrastructure from critical terrorist attacks. Think Colonial Pipeline. Think the JB Meatpacking. Think every single hack that's happening every single day. Today, tomorrow, it's just hack after hack after hack. So we're losing, and and this is just, and these are just growing, these policies. Now we're still all the way back in 2002. We're still 20 years ago. All right. So that led to the creation of the FISMA project in 2003, and that was really to start writing some of these documents. They cranked out 50. NIST SP, so a little bit, if you see NIST SP 800, that means all of the documents that are really related to federal kind of contracting. And so 853 was about internal systems. Then, they took a little bit of that and made that into SP 171, which is what you as federal contractors, if you're in the defense space, are really dealing with. If you're not in the defense space, it's what you're gonna be dealing with. CUI will be moving to the FAR clause, and we'll talk about that a little bit. So, but this project did change from the FISMA project. It is now called the Risk Management Project. And I think that is where we're even starting way back to start to see the transition from thinking more just cybersecurity, where cybersecurity is just one big piece of supply chain risk management. So this list of FIPS 199 and FIPS 200. So we're still in 2002. But why this is important are for these three things: low, moderate, and high. And on the left, in the column A, you see confidentiality, integrity, and availability, the CIA triad. For those who aren't familiar with that, that's kind of like the big kind of like, to go to Zelda, that's the Triforce. And you look at those three things, and what the OMB office did, the Office of Management Budget, is they came up with this idea of what are these categories and what kinds of protections they need to do based on the risk. I mean, this is basically a risk matrix. And the important box is that moderate, because that is what they determined contractors might need to start protecting. Now, we get to 2009. The NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act. Very, very first time that we start to see the supply chain risk management in the federal congressional record. Those words are used in laws to Congress. FISMA talked about risk management, but now we're really specifically talking about supply chain risk management starting in about 10 years ago. While this was going on, we then passed the it's not passed, it's an executive order, it's a signature. President Obama signed Executive Order 13556 to create controlled unclassified information. And this had really not much to do with cybersecurity or supply chain risk management, but came out of the 9/11 Commission report from 10 years ago that said, OMG, we have 18 agencies, they have 14,332 different ways to label, sensitive data. We need one. So all these agencies got together, and President Obama signed this executive order, and that made all the agencies get together. And who was in charge of that was the National Archives and Records Association, NARA, and specifically ISOO under there. And they made up these categories of CUI. Now, in the 2011 NDAA, here it has an entire section of the law on supply chain risk management. So we've gone from 2009, never mentioning supply chain risk management, to 2011, to where now an entire section of the National Defense Authorization Act really hits down on supply chain risk reduction. Now, this is where it starts. And I do apologize for the other government contractors. Let me know if my camera's out of phase, because I'm not looking at myself. If you do not work in the defense space, a lot of this is directed at more towards that GovCon section. But what we are talking about, the CUI, and you folks, if you don't do DFARS, which is Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplemental, then you're governed by FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation. CUI is coming to FAR. So, I don't know how it will happen, when it will happen. It's a little late, but most of this talk will be relevant to all government contractors. And the other thing is the baselines that the Department of Defense is applying for contractors on 171 for their systems, that has nothing to do with your PII or your personal identifying information. So if I have 17 employees, the government doesn't make me protect that PII under the contract. I still need to, because I don't want to get sued. And the requirements for my own data, they're getting closer and closer and closer to the 171 baseline. So you're almost better off as a business in any federal contracting space to really start now, like now, not yesterday now, not tomorrow now, right now, to start thinking about getting your business up to a 171 level of compliance. That is the future. I mean, we're not going to make cybersecurity less stringent. So you need to start thinking about this. This is going back to 2011. Now, this proposed case was this idea of how do we safeguard unclassified information? Because what NARA and ISOO did is they said, this is CUI. Every single agency is responsible for telling us how they're going to protect it. This is the method that the Department of Defense took, was to come up with some clauses in the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation. And this got updated in 2013 and to apply to fundamental research. This is really important for universities in the government space who use a lot of these tools. You cannot hide behind the fact that every SBIR is a contract, or is a grant, not a contract. That is not true. The difference between whether an SBIR, that's I forget the exact small business, free money for small businesses is what it stands for. And non-dilutive funding to grow small businesses, to put it in more official terms. But if that information is not meant for public release, that is not a grant. That is a contract. There are certain agencies that can issue contracts under SBIR. Most of the university grants that they think are mostly at university awards under SBIR, that universities and professors think are grants, are really contracts. And all of these rules will apply to universities. So it gets enacted in 2013. This is when the 7,000 rule goes into effect. And that is when now you are responsible by law to protect controlled unclassified information. Well, not by law, by regulation, nitpicking. To control unclassified information on your federal contracts. 2014, now we get the detection and avoidance of counterfeit electronic parts that have to do like further implementation. So they've been, in terms of supply chain risk management, this has been one of the major concerns. Like, could a little chip be added to a motherboard from a router built in China that just sucks up all your data? So in 2014, the DoD required, to really acquire electronics from very select suppliers. Now, DFARS case 2013 DO18 kicks in about 2015, and this is about the cloud. All right. So this adds in rules about 7008, 7009, and then the 7010 club. Basically, we just call them all the 700 series. It's your coming to God moment. It's a 700 club. So basically, this idea that you needed to start protecting your cloud information. And what does that mean to have information and controlled unclassified information in the cloud? 2016, it is now a final rule. DFARS is now, it's been approved, it was an interim rule, and then it goes into effect in November, right at the end of, or start of 2017. So this means you now have to self-attest to your ability to meet the 7012 clauses. You cannot accept money from the government on a DFARS clause with the 70 or contract with the 7012 clause without self-attesting that says you have good cybersecurity hygiene. And that is when that really ended in January 1st, 2018. After January 1st, 2018, if you've taken money from the government with the 7012 clause, guess what? You told them you're already compliant to 171, right? So you've been telling them for a long time that you've been doing things that you have not been doing. That's usually considered a no-no, lying on federal contracts to get money. But everybody did it, and that's the place we're in. They all know you did it. But this does have interesting impacts in terms of funding. It's hard to convince the federal government to underwrite the fraud that you've committed for the last 5 years. I mean, it's hard to get the government to pay for crime. So you have to really consider that as you're negotiating and dealing with Congress. And then this doesn't get talked about much, but a lot of the CMMC history and why it happened, it really came out of a classified report on the Missile Defense Agency, and it was scathing. I mean, it was just I've never seen it. I've only seen the redacted FOAI requested version, but this report just absolutely ripped them up for not not being in compliance with 171 requirements. To the point where they even did a follow-up study and did a second report, and they're like, okay, that's it. Nobody is doing the DFAR 7012 clause. That should be DFARS, that's a spelling mistake. No one's doing it. None of the MBA suppliers who had contracts that subcontracts were actually doing 7012. They said they did, so something had to change. And that is CMMC. Now, in January 31st of 2020, the DoD released the first model of the CMMC program, and that put an end to the self-attestation. of your 171 compliance. You straight up, like this requires 2 changes. There is no more POAM, which is a plan of action and milestones, basically saying, you have 2 documents, your security plan, your SSP, and then your POAM. Most people's SSP should be like this and a POAM short. But what happened is you had SSPs and then POAMs. And people just would couch all their stuff and say, oh, it's in my POAM. I'll get to it later. The cybersecurity. I just want to build parts. And so nothing was happening. And so what happened, the Department of Defense took, at November 30th of 2020, took this big step of putting an interim rule on DFARS clauses 7018, 7019, and 7021. The 7018 clause requires every contractor to upload their SRPS score, which is how you score your SSP, to a computer system, and so that they can, you have to actually upload it. The DCMA can then look at that score and say, you know what? Based on the kind of data you have, we think you need a medium review, so the 7019 clause can kick in. And that just means that they can go in and talk to you, maybe do site visits, but they'll just double check on your score entries. But the 7021 clause, that can full on kick in CMMC requirements. However, only the Undersecretary of Acquisitions and ANS can actually assign that 7021 clause right now until 7026 or 7025 or 2025, 2026, when CMMC will go, when the 7021 clause will hit every single contract. But until that time, there's only one person who can actually assign a 7021 clause. There are some pilots, and there's going to be many people. Here's the thing: if a task order or an award gets amended, which happens all the time, then those rules can kick in. All right. So that's really the brief history before we get so how do you do that? And that's the point of today's talk. We just have to get through that history of how do you do this and create this culture of cybersecurity, knowing that, if the Missile Defense Authority is struggling to do this, how is your little mom and pop shop going to handle this? So we have to do that through a building of culture. So let me stop sharing my screen there. And are there any questions from the panelists at this time, or comments on that brief history? Or I did do it brief. I will add more. I mean, there's so many more little tidbits and reports and hacks that change things. I didn't even put in the SolarWinds hacks or Stuxnet or Warhammer. All these things that really crank up pressure. So while we've been making all these changes, we've also had these giant hacks that have really kicked in and started to put a lot of pressure onto the environment. So any questions on that super fast, wildly and incomplete history of cybersecurity maturity model? All right. That being said, yes.
Actually, I have a question or a comment. So you mentioned the CUI, not because you're focused on the defense, the DFARS, but I'm at a civilian agency, and I would tell you, I'm required to do annual CUI training, and so as well as our contractors. So it has boiled over to the civilian side as well.
Well, see, so CUI, that's the thing. CUI has nothing to do with CMMC.
True.
And DFARS, except everything.
Right.
But when I say it's nothing, I went back and said it was created by that executive order, and I think it's I can't remember, Leighton, you might correct me, I think it's 18 agencies, but all 18 agencies are required to protect controlled unclassified information. So, Jeremy, I'm in a college. FERPA is a kind of CUI. The big difference is, Jeremy, you actually have to have that federal contract. So that means that your commercial business has some kind of federal contract. Because you can generate CUI, or that you can inherit it from the government, or your subcontractors can inherit it, but it just has to always be on behalf of the federal government. What I'm talking about more specifically, Jeremy, are the rules. Like right now, you don't have to protect your CUI against 171. You protect it based on whatever agency, so say it was the Department of Ed or the Department of Energy, you protect CUI on however they told ISO and NARA what their agency policy is.
Yes.
What's happening, and it's going to happen, actually, I'll check, I'll get you a date in a second, but it's going to happen probably in September, December of this year, January, is they're adapting CUI and 171. So you will inherit those 171. Some of them. We don't, these are up on the rules. But yeah, so Jeremy, I think you're probably in better shape. If you guys already started a document, you have a CUI policy, and you have CUI training, that's a good place to be in. What agency do you know, or do you mind? If you can't tell, it's okay.
I can tell you. Yeah, I work for a very small agency called Millennium Challenge Corporation. We're in the
which agency do you guys usually contract with?
I'm sorry?
Help that, do you know what federal agencies usually contract with?
That was I'm actually at a federal agency, so.
Oh, okay. I apologize. Yeah, so yeah, you guys really have to. So I was thinking more of the contractors who contract with you, they should technically be following the same CUI policies you folks are. They're not yet, because that hasn't happened. I apologize for this.
Right, because we don't have the FAR clauses. That's right.
Yeah, it's coming. And it's
what about the latest executive order that, and I don't know how it impacts CMMC yet, but in terms of like the supply chain requirements, we have software bill of materials now that we're required to put into contract.
If you notice, Jeremy, that's why I really highlighted throughout that history from 2002 how while we've been doing the cybersecurity stuff, you already, as far back as 2002, started to see first the risk management, and SP 837, and start to really pick in. And then you had the supply chain risk management get renamed. What also, and this is in the talk, I should probably go at it, just know how into the weeds I wanted to get, was there was a restructuring at the ONS with ANS, and actually the ANS's CISO got moved under industrial policy. Ken Salazar, who's now in charge of industrial policy, he came from McKinsey, so has a very strong risk management background, not a security background. And CMMC is now a subset under that chain. So there's a reason that this history of CMMC class that I'm teaching, it goes back and forth whether it's called history of CMMC or future of supply chain risk management, because I think those are two synonymous topics. And so what we have to do with the CMMC there is really think about what's going to happen with that order. You don't have level 4 and 5 out yet, Jeremy. And there's another document called SP 172 and then 172A. So you might see a lot of that get put into levels 4 and 5. I think long term, CMMC might get remixed into SCRM. CMMC will eventually spell supply chain risk management, in my opinion. That's opinion. No, I'm literally just a teacher, a dude with a blog with no connections. Any other questions before we really start talking about some of these issues? All right. Well, I'm tired of two things really in this space. You have this constant battle between compliance people and technical people, and saying, what's the right answer? Is it, you have to be a wire twister to get this right. No, you have to know about GRC to get this right. And everyone's like, they're both talking about like forest and trees. Like, can you see? Everybody's looking through the forest, only seeing the trees, and people only seeing the trees and not the forest. I'm like, ignore the trees together, all of them. Because what I'm more interested in are the roots of cybersecurity. Because if you think about a tree, think about it, watch every one of my markers be dead. All right. Is that a good color for you guys? Can you see that marker? All right. So if you think about a tree, you do have your canopy in your forest, but I think I don't want to start here, and I don't want to start here. Cybersecurity to me starts at the roots, right? And the root systems of the trees are 20 times bigger than the actual trees. The canopy, so this canopy, the root system of the tree is 20 times bigger. And your cybersecurity is the same way. It's all underground. It's not going to be stuff that you see. Yeah, there'll be leaves and posters and policies hanging up in your office, but it all happens underground in part of your culture. Because why does this work? How does this work? Well, we have to look to protecting what I call, somebody else called it first, the wood wide web. Because in this root system, there are millions and millions and millions and millions of miles of tiny fungi, psyllium, that connect all of the trees. millions of miles, hundreds of millions of miles under the forest floor. And this tree can tell this tree when it's under a persistent attack. So the trees have an APT network that they deploy underground fighting through this fungus. At the same time, there's a whole bunch of other fungus that's always trying to test their physical boundaries and their logical boundaries to break in and get inside of the tree and kill it. So this fungus is fighting that fungus, and we just got to find the fungi among I to really get to our roots of cybersecurity. And when I look to that, it's not that, oh, let me grab a better color marker. When I look to the roots of cybersecurity, I see you have to do 5 things first. Every one of them has to be done first. It's kind of that way. Access control, I mean, that's the heart of cybersecurity, right? Who can do people, only the people who have access to it, need it, and get it? Access control, your inventory. How many places, Michelle and Peter, you guys work with, you're an MSP working with manufacturers. How many people can actually tell you the number of endpoints in their business? And if you can't tell me the number of endpoints, the number of devices connecting to the internet that you have in your business, you can't have cybersecurity. If you can't tell me an inventory of, if I can't see like a separation of duty chart, you're probably not, like, you can't even count your people. How do you have good cybersecurity? Put it this way, the Department of Defense doesn't even know how many defense contractors there are. So, so it starts with inventory, and that's one of our bigger issues. And then, of course, policy, and this is a major change. Actually, I should put that in there. In CMMC, it came from CERT RMM, which is the maturity model. There's a lot of policy out there, like a lot of policy. And we'll do a whole talk on policy later on in the weeks. And then you also need your awareness and training and your governance. But I'm playing with this theory right now that awareness and training, if you drive your supply chain risk management through your awareness and training, if you're not a really mature company, like I work at Southern Connecticut State University, our IT policy is very mature. To change it takes about a year. You have to go through multiple committees, multiple state levels. So it would be harder for myself. Yet, if you are handling your, a younger organization or an MSP like Peter and Michelle that are just starting this journey to decide if they want to really like get into this business and help manufacturers, or if they're like, I'm out, that's where you really have to start thinking about how can you become a compliance partner. And the reason I say that we drive this, and this is where I'm going to show how we're doing in our class right now with Microsoft Teams, I think you can drive your compliance journey through awareness and training, because culture is the only way that we are going to get this done. Literally. Like, it takes a culture of change. And when you look at the awareness and training, I'm going to be mapping it out over the next few days, you're going to see this idea that, okay, if I start thinking about, like, I inventory all of my awareness and training, do I have it? You may have none, but you have to train, like, do you do phishing attack trainings? Do you know, for example, like your internal threat awareness and your external threats? You only have to do that at level 4. I suggest you do that right away with your entire company right off the bat. Like, you need to understand, you need to do the risk analysis and really understand, like, who's coming after you and why and where are your weak points, right? And you can start there, and then you start to develop your security plan. You start to develop your POEM from there. And what I'm going to do now, I'll stop there in that brief little talk. What I want to do now is then just quickly go through, show us how we use Microsoft Teams in a class that I'm running right now at Southern Connecticut State University to help contractors get ready for either CUI or just CMMC or cybersecurity in general. People take our class. Like right now, Peter and Michelle, they're both MSPs in Connecticut who support OSCs. Those are organizations seeking certification, fancy pants way of saying manufacturer or small business that has a contract with the government. And they have to decide how do they want to protect them. And if so, if they do decide that they're going to protect the MSPs, are they going to be in scope or out of scope? Like, and that depends on every one of their contracts, every one of their SLAs. Michelle has an on-prem, backup center that sounds probably pretty legit to almost close to being compliant, just from the words that came out of your mouth, Michelle. Like you said things that most of the MSPs don't know. You had a lot of the right switches, right servers. You understood what FIPS 200 meant. So like for you might even be further along. But Peter, you weren't here for that call, but we talked about it with Michelle as an MSP, thinking, wait a minute, maybe it's easier for me to just leave my system as is, and then if I want to do further CUI work with clients, I'll build a separate offsite enclave. Or do I get my onsite enclave, up to speed? So those are all the choices that you and Michelle and other MSPs have to make. Is first, A, do I want to be in this business? Because it is expensive and hard, but there's a ton of opportunity. B, Vince is in the wrong meeting. Hold on, I gotta tell Vince is in the wrong meeting. Anybody from class late, and if you want to just text Vince that we have, give him the other link. So what we were saying is that we have to really get into that. So let me quickly share what we are working on in terms of our class. And are there any questions there before I move on? I'm going to tell, hold on, wait, Vince. All right. So let me quickly share my screen and I'll go through kind of how we set up our classes and some of the challenges that I face when doing, when teaching through Teams. But why did we pick Teams? Well, A, it's what everybody has. I mean, most people are doing this either on GCC commercial or GCC high, and you have access to Microsoft Teams 10. And B, learning should be modality and device agnostic. How do I teach you to learn in my class? You read, you write, you do. You can read, write, do, and anywhere. But I pick the tools that you have available to you as an organization because you can start creating a company-wide culture by deploying a chat platform that integrates into your Office 365 settings. Like so many companies have Office 365, but then they use Slack and Zoom. It's, well, A, you're paying for the same services twice, always silly, unless it improves compliance. And we'll talk about how we added, what we did to get around SharePoint, because, well, you know how that goes. So you're paying for extra services. So why not build your company culture building into your actual learning classrooms? So how do I build culture? Well, the very first thing is when you look at our syllabus, oh, it's hot. Oops, which I don't have there. So let me pull up my syllabus. But, I've taken on this idea of, we use community of inquiry model, and the community of inquiry model is just, it takes social presence. Like, do people feel welcomed and not lost in the class, which is why I do a module 0. And then to give them time to work it out. And then there's the cognitive presence. Do you give them tools? Like the biggest threat to our cybersecurity has been our cybersecurity training. It's it. Like you can't learn cybersecurity by watching a video and taking a quiz, right? That's not awareness. That's not training. That's compliance. And you're just doing a video-based quiz so you can check off a box and say that you're compliant. But you know what? You're still at risk, because you've not built the culture that you need for your employees to thrive. And then so what we do for that other kinds of cybersecurity is if you look at a module, like we're in the history of cybersecurity right now, and you go to the module tasks, these are set up in what I say, there's your reading, there's a reading task. Here's a hack for all of you commercial, industrial, I almost want to call it, because it's not instructional designers, you're almost industrial designers, de-instructional designers. this idea that you just assign a reading and you're done. No, go back to reading and research. And what I always do, one of the ways that I hack learning and build culture, is I tell people what I want them to read for, because they're not going to do the whole reading. And what do we know about good readers is they know how to skim with a purpose. So you always have learning objectives, and then you go back and I give you a purpose to read. Complete a semantic feature analysis while completing the video readings to compare past and present regulations on protecting sensitive data. So I already tell you, you're looking as you read for past regulations on sensitive data. Always give your reader a purpose. Then you move on to the writing task. And Jeremy, look at this one, right for your question. Based on President Biden's executive order, make a prediction on how CMMC may evolve to include supply chain risk management. So now I've also given a purpose to that task, and it's authentic because it's real life. And then there's always a performance activity that's designed to then elicit knowledge growth against those learning objectives. Design a timeline of efforts to reduce the risk of data exfiltration in the supply chain from the passage of FISMA, the spelling mistake there, to the DFAR 7021 clauses being included in all 7012 contracts. Think about the model I just did. I provided you with an exemplar text of, that was a timeline. That's all that was. It was just a string of dates in a line. And so that you build that little bit of culture through that process. And then there's always some criteria that's possible evidence that you would then be assessed on with your badges. Now, so that's really how we set up the class through the sections. And then it's divided into Intro to CMMC, History of CMMC, Securing Sensitive Data. So what does this mean for my company really using awareness and training to drive our compliance journey? When you look at, if you go back and look at starting off NIST SP18, which tells you how to write your SSP, the very, very first thing you have to do is figure out who's the boss. And so like a company like yours, Peter, you might be the boss in 7 other jobs, but you still have to like write down, you might wear 7 hats, but you need to initial each one of those PV and write those down. And once that's done, now you can start thinking about, okay, let's look at our training programs, because that is a domain of CMMC, is awareness and training. But it hits so many other domains, because you're gonna need a media policy on how do you you're gonna need an MDM policy. You either allow devices or you don't. And if you do, what's the policy? How about MFA? The hardest thing on my campus right now, I'm still carrying around 2 devices, because it's just their instructions on like when you get a new device and to move your authenticator app over to a new device. They just aren't good. It's not good policy. It's not good training out there. So it's a good way to inventory your policy. Because if you don't have the policy, if you don't have the training for the policy, you probably don't have the policy. So inventory is, along with awareness and training, is one of the other 5 things you're doing first. But I haven't formulated totally these ideas around building this culture this way, but I'm really fascinated on this idea that we could build up our culture through the roots of cybersecurity. And start there. What's the difference between awareness and training? I can be aware of phishing attacks because you hang posters around my office. And you might even put it on my, you might even put it on the banner of our computers. Hey, do not click addresses on funny emails. If you don't know the sender, don't click on that link. Don't say, that's awareness. Training is doing a phishing test and then providing remediation for people who fail. You are required under CMMC to do both awareness and training, and we really break them up into 4 areas. The first one kind of being on your policy, then your governance. You have to have a CUI policy. That's in CMMC, is you have to have an explicit CUI policy and training on that policy. And then finally, in that 4th one, and it's more for your systems. And that's where people like Michelle and Peter come in, because this is more about reference architecture, and every one of your operating systems will have a different, so you might need multiple trainings based on your major and minor systems and the different operating systems that they have. So Peter's awareness and training will be different than Michelle's. And so what you really have to do is work. I think if you really start to, that your goal is to create a workplace where your people aren't just thinking about forest and trees, but are all contributing to a healthier soil, where they're all being the fertilizer of growth, you can look at cybersecurity as doing business better. And if you address it as not so much of a risk management, but an opportunity and growth zone, I think there's a lot in there for it. And that's pretty much what I have. Are there any questions from anybody? And then I can go through some of the other questions. So I've not seen any questions. Let me share my screen again and just show, go over the assignments that are due to show how we build culture in this module. So we're right now starting the history of CMMC, and we went over the reading tasks that you have to do, the semantic feature analysis, and the writing task, and then we have the timeline. Now your timeline can be paper-based, but this is going to be, it's just you have to know this knowledge for when you're talking to people. So those are, if you look at our intro to CMMC assignments, you have, how do I start my CMMC journey? We talked about this whole idea of defining the roles and what you had to do, but if you go back and look at the actual assignments, as I try to find them, oh well. This is one of the struggles you have with teams. Sometimes you get lost in your navigations a little bit. Oh, there it is, module tasks. So when we look at what we did last week, or last couple of days, as these days go by fast, we were doing, our reading task was to look at the introduction to CMMC, define the difference between CUI and FCI, and then create a one-page glossary of all the CMMC terms and players. OSC, RPO, RP, LTP, LPP, C3PAO. There's so many acronyms in government contracting. And then here's a good example of a performance activity. There's a one-page flyer explaining the CMMC program from a manufacturer defense contractor and one for a managed service provider, because your audience changes the culture that you're trying to build. Plain and simple. So what you also can do, though, you don't, like Michelle and Peter and everybody in the class, Jacob, they don't have to do these assignments. They can bring their own subjectives and then align them to my objectives. So Jacob, right now, he's an intern with Data Intelligence Technologies, and he's working on their customer inheritance matrices that they could then pass their employers. Like Michelle and Peter, as MSPs, they have to come up with inheritance matrices themselves. Because Michelle she has an on-prem backup system. So what controls does she take care of completely and partially? And of those that are partial, what's left for the MSP, or the OSC, sorry, the organization seeking certification, what do they have to add to then be fully compliant on those controls? So Jacob is working on that much bigger sheet, and I work with him over the 6 weeks to align that class. So it's been a super interesting way. One of the things that we've discovered with teams, the tenants. We might end up getting our own commercial tenant because I work at a university. We started using Microsoft Teams Classroom Edition. That had way too many security controls where guest users could not see chat. So we decided last week to try the PLC version of Microsoft Teams. Last week, guest users could use chat. Today, we all went into the meeting, guest users could not use chat. There was some kind of update or change. So we went this whole big workaround. The other issue that we always bump into is SharePoint. SharePoint causes so many headaches because we have so many guest users in a state system that has multiple levels of access control. So what we did is we added a private AWS Gov cloud share service so that companies that don't want to share their information publicly with the rest of the class, they can go into their tenant in their cloud share and share their information that way privately with me as an instructor. Some Penn State was in my last class and they were writing their SSP. There's a lot of that they don't want in public. Other companies were working on their CUI enclave policies. That was not going to be public information. So they put that in their cloud share. I almost recommend almost every organization, like even if you have GCC High, even if you use Lockpoint, even if you use SharePoint or Locker, I forget all of the controls, bad UX is so related to culture because people just want to get their job done. So as soon as a user hits bad UX in cybersecurity, they will look for a workaround. For example, my university, file sharing outside of our school turns off every 7 days. If you're doing a big research project with universities all over the world, you're going to go outside of the system and you're going to use Google Docs because you don't want to reset the link every 7 days. And also we do a lot more collaborative writing than you do in like the government contracting spaces, you know, and collaborative writing in some of the higher versions of Teams gets a little bit more difficult. So you have to think about, once you do that risk management with your team and you know your team and you've assessed kind of like their understanding, is like, what parts of that culture can you do and start building it? Like, what are your biggest threats? And how do you build a culture around cybersecurity that will help you do business better? Because we don't even start talking about, Jeremy, we don't even start talking about 53 or 171 controls until we've gone through this whole idea of, okay, let's inventory your policy. Let's talk about doing business better and talk about basic safeguarding. And now it's like, OMG, look at how many of these practices we've already taken care of by just focusing in on a culture of doing business better through cybersecurity. And so there's a lot of opportunity for growth, I think, for these states and contractors. And for the contractors that you work for, Jeremy, that are just on the commercial side of government contracting, on the FAR side, get ready now. Do not wait for the FAR rule to hit, or the CUI rule to hit FAR. And we know, if I can check, give me a second to check on that, we know that's coming, and it's coming a lot faster than you think. It's going to hit, that FAR rule will hit it's been, you know, it's about 5 years late. And late, and if you, late and left. As I say, if he knew anything about it, he could then add in, because it is going to, I think, change a lot of what will happen. So before I move on, are there any questions on where we are now? I'm actually looking for the date of, there was some general news about the FAR rule changing. All right, I can't find the link right off the top of my head, but I just saw the article, so I will post it to you, Jeremy, that you can share it around, because people do need to be aware that it is coming very soon. Was it in policy that I was discussing? It's one of those things where I'm like, I'm in too many chat rooms and I can't figure out which one, where I got that really cool information. And I'm like, oh, okay. All right, I quit. I'll look later. So any questions for me on, I just want you to understand, cybersecurity is not going to get easier. It's going to get harder. But the way that you handle harder is through awareness and training. The only way to make things easier is through learning, right? Because somebody else's easy is somebody else's hard. And the difference is whether they've learned or not. And so Peter and Michelle, that's also something that you as vendors can think about offering. Like you could create, they're going to choose the MSPs that are compliance partners. So if you can have an awareness and training program that walks them through writing their reference architecture to their systems, that while then they're also working on their SSP and their POEMs at the same time, that can become a differentiator, because now you're helping them be compliant on their awareness and training domain at the same time. Plus you have a new vertical that you can charge people for, the awareness and training program that you offer.
Go figure. Yeah,
so that's like that. I always look at any risk as, how can I make a buck off of this? You know, like people think risk and problems, I think opportunity. And so that's me where when I look at cybersecurity, I'm also doing this because I consider it to be identity. You know, I think in a way that we sort of failed. I'm a teacher. Half my town doesn't believe that the election actually happened, right? Or that, you know, they think that the vaccines are Bill Gates' way of putting a chip in your arm. These are smart people that fell victim to 30 years of warfare and psychological warfare. But it's scary. And we as teachers failed. For 10 years, we've been talking about, building up your own digital cyber infrastructure and trying to get kids to understand that your identity is cybersecurity. You need to own your data and your story. And that's the same thing as your business. So I moved out of the K-12 space into the government space around cybersecurity because I almost feel like I failed. Like literally, like for 15 years, we've been trying to get people to start building in these lessons into schools. So like going back to 2001, 2000, well, yeah, I started teaching 2001. So about the same time that, that DOD has been working on this issue, I've been trying to work on this issue in the K-12 cycle, because you have to remember, when CMMC hits in 2026, those kids are in 8th grade right now. So we have to start building this culture in our high schools. You have to start building it with your kids at home by teaching them their own password management skills and talking about how cybersecurity is part of their everyday life. Do they really need to have Siri and Google and all those IoT devices with open endpoints in your house all the time? Is the smartest house the dumbest house? These are all conversations that you should be having with your children and your employees, because it always will boil down to the roots of cybersecurity. And just please turn on MFA. That's like, I want to like just throw that out. It's like, that's like the fertilizer to put on the soil, I guess. It's just go turn on your MFA, and then figure out how hard it is to use Duo. So those are, that's kind of the talk and where I've been coming from for this hour. And I'm glad you had me here, Jeremy, for this conversation.